joined today by Dr. Alan Wolfelt. As many of you know, Alan is our teacher, our mentor, and our friend, and he's been instrumental in the evolution of Eric's House. I asked Alan to join me today to talk about a topic that I know that he's particularly passionate about, and that's the diagnosis in the DSM of prolonged grief disorder. Welcome, Alan, and thank you so much. We're so grateful that you could make time to join us.
Greg, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you so much. I appreciate our relationship between the Center for Loss and Life Transition and Eric's House. It's an honor.
It has been an honor for us and very formative. I first learned about this diagnosis, prolonged grief disorder, in one of your classes that I was attending probably a year and a half ago. And I think the diagnosis had just been entered into the DSM a year or so before that.
March of 2022. March of 2022 is when
okay,
that.
thank you. And so for those of us for the lay people that are watching this, the DSM, as I understand it, is kind of a catalog of diagnoses for clinicians, and it includes some recommended treatments. Is that a fair assessment?
It often gets referred to as the mental health Bible. Yeah, it's put out by the American Psychiatric Association, and every few years they get together and revise and update that, and that's exactly what occurred with this new diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder that was initiated in March of 22 in the DSM-5 TR.
Okay. Can you tell us what your concerns are with this diagnosis and what the implications are for someone who receives the diagnosis as a griever?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me be able to have a forum, because as you may know, I very much advocate against it. And why is that? Well, to me, the application of a linear model to symptoms that often extend well beyond the timeframes that they delineated, at 12 months for adults, 6 months for children and adolescents, is grossly inappropriate in my experience of 40 years of walking with and learning from thousands of mourners, that we're one of the few cultures that in fact uses a linear discrete time frame. Whereas if you contrast this across cultures, they have Days of the Dead, series of ceremonies. But as we become, I guess, Greg, more what I and other authors have termed mourning avoidant and emotion phobic, there's been more of a push toward cure instead of care. And when that happens, and it evolves out of a traditional medical model, then you see the evolution of these criteria being interfaced with linear time frames. Particularly when I thought this morning, as I was reflecting on us getting together, when you think of the population that you are so supportive of, when you think of sudden unexpected deaths, be it suicide, overdose deaths, I think in my experience of walking with, again, and learning from the population of survivors of sudden traumatic death, that to project that kind of a time frame adds stigma to them, and to me is really a form of what I refer to as secondary victimization. It increases that stigmatization and is really counter to a mantra that I know that you've heard me say in my trainings, that with people in grief doing the best they know to do, that there should be no rewards for speed. And in fact, what this diagnosis does is say, essentially, the faster you do this, the more you're less likely to have a disorder, when in fact grief is recursive. There's nodal events that come up where you have more heightened symptoms again that aren't tied to 6 or 12 months. Let me say this too, and then I'll be quiet. It's a brief response to the question, but I work with thousands of bereaved children and teens, and they have what I term in my writings, very appropriately, developmentally, an appropriate lack of feelings. And so for clinicians to decide that if they have these criteria after 6 months is so grossly inappropriate, because they're going to do a lot of natural catch-up, more active mourning after they use the normal defense that I've written about in the childhood grief literature as the apparent lack of feelings. Doesn't mean that underneath that they haven't taught us they're very impacted by being bereaved, which I remind our listeners means literally to be torn apart and have some very unique needs. One they have is for a culture to be more understanding that that we don't mourn over a specific linear period of time and stop and are done, but there's going to be natural resurgence of the very symptoms that they outlined in the criteria where you meet prolonged grief disorder. So that's a brief response to your excellent question. Thank you.
As a layperson in this, I share those concerns. I find the label very judgmental. Um, uh, Actually, of the three words prolonged grief disorder, my real issues are with the first word and the last word. So thinking that,
Yes, prolonged.
right,
That tells
labeling
me you're
it
doing it too long. Yeah.
exactly. Labeling it prolonged to me implies that, you know, you're not doing it right. You're not doing it fast enough. And to call it a disorder says that you're not even grieving right. And it feels so judgmental. And it's absolutely the last thing that people dealing with these kinds of grief, especially because of all the other complications that arise when you lose someone to suicide or substance abuse, it really seems like a disservice. I'm curious, though, what are the criteria that are used to justify this diagnosis?
Well, the specific criteria, one thing I'd like to mention before we go on there, though, is that, my observation is that we have a tendency to label things a disorder when we lose an understanding of them. And as we have very clearly become a more mourning avoidant culture with short social norms, there's a tendency of some people, of course, not all, to move toward an attempt to cure or resolve grief as opposed to understanding we are transformed and changed forever. Transformation means an entire change in form. And again, it demands convalescence. It's slow, it's recursive. It causes a natural instinctive turning inward. And as one finds safe people and safe places to mourn, they're still going to ride that roller coaster that you witness in your caregiving to people after a death. In terms of the specific criteria, Greg, again, the time frame: adults 1 year, children and teens 6 months. They must meet, and I'll outline for you the symptoms. They must have 3 symptoms that I'll note below every day for at least 1 month prior to the diagnosis. And what are those? And I'm currently writing a piece taking each one of the symptoms and building a case against why we shouldn't apply prolonged grief disorder to people's doing the best they know to do, because it's ludicrous in my 40 years of experience. If you look at these individual criteria and you can counter how that doesn't fit with many, many mourners. So identity disruption, one of the symptoms, feeling as if part of you has died. Well, I hear that every day, way beyond that linear time frame where I feel like when he or she died, part of me died, lost sense of self. We love from the outside in, we mourn from the inside out. That takes a lot of hard work as we dose the central needs of mourning to get there. So we shouldn't apply a linear model. There can be all sorts of influences on that in terms of that disruption, if you will. A second criteria is marked sense of disbelief. Well, that has to do with the normal evade encounter that comes with loss. And some people will have what we call psychic numbing or acute aftershock for various contributors to why that could be. And so when we say that, you have a marked sense of disbelief, yeah, something in your head, not your heart, to tie that again to a linear time frame without looking at what are the influences on that. I can deal with what I know, not what I don't know. So if somebody has inhibitors related to figuring out what happened here, they'll have more psychic numbing, and that can last well beyond those time frames. Avoidance or reminders of the fact that the person has died. And again, I would use my model of that's a natural dance between the need to evade and encounter. You can know it in your head, and the next minute the phone rings, and all of a sudden you think, could that be them calling? And again, when we tie that to a linear model, we don't look at all the other influences on why that might occur. Intense emotional pain. Well, I would hope so. I mean, that's the nature of grief and the need to mourn, and you ride that in the form of a roller coaster. And again, I'll say it again, when you tie it to linear model without looking at the influences or the etiology of why that might be, the why, then you're doing a disservice to the mourner. Difficulty with reintegration. Well, that could be influenced by coming from a closed family system that doesn't allow for mourning. It can be influenced by a lack of general support, where you have more challenge reintegrating. Like C.S. Lewis said, he felt like a leper because his people around him went away. So it's hard to reintegrate when you don't have longer term forms of support in a culture that has short social norms. And then just again, I'd remind our viewers that we live in a pretty mourning avoidant culture in general. That can influence that. And a couple others, emotional numbness. Well, again, you ride a roller coaster and that numbness will come and go, and that's appropriate. It's a normal defense that says, it's not that I'm denying the reality of it, but there's a dance between evading the encounter of the hard work of mourning and need to at times very naturally push that encounter away. And that's so true with your population. Think of a premature, unexpected, calamitous coming together, creating natural complications where that emotional numbness can go way beyond that 12-month period. And certainly for children and teens, way beyond 6. I hope you would agree. I'd love your comments on some of these when I conclude. Feeling that life is meaningless is another one of the criteria. Well, one of my central needs of mourning is the search for meaning. I always say those who do not search do not find, but it's a longer term need. You don't wake up the day after somebody dies and say, I can't wait to go to work. You are thrown into the wilderness of your grief. And we know it's kind of a higher level need down the line that I'm going to figure out what am I going to do to make meaning and purpose following this death. And so when we again tie it to linear model, we're saying you better find meaning, but find it within 12 months or you may get a disorder. Absolutely ridiculous and inappropriate, an attack on someone's self-esteem that they're already struggling with because bereavement attacks the core of how you feel about yourself. Intense loneliness. Well, we already have an epidemic of loneliness in our culture, for one, that with this being fortunately acknowledged more and more. I wrote a book this past year on created a loneliness inventory to people look at their humanness, that there's times in life when they feel alone. And that can vary depending upon one's support system. If you're in a closed family system that says, come over at Thanksgiving here next month, but don't bring it up, we're going to watch football and eat turkey, then you'll feel alone even in the presence of other people who aren't affirming and aren't grief informed. So that was kind of a long-winded response, but I hope it was helpful because you asked what are their criteria. And as you walk through those, to me, you can see how inappropriate it is that they're tied to this linear model.
You know, I couldn't agree more. And even just based on my personal experience after we lost Eric, honestly, I wasn't ready to start doing the work of mourning for 9 months. And even then, it was a slow start. And many of our clients, the first year is often spent in extended periods of numbness, and that
Yes.
it's I we have really tried to live the mantra that there's no reward for speed and that everyone has the right to set their own pace. So I think that's really important, and I can't imagine why, if there were a period, if there were some sort of timeline, why it would be any shorter for teenagers or children. Their losses are as deep and probably more nuanced because they don't have a framework for life without that person in it. And so,
And then they have, as you know, Greg, all these developmental nodal points. You go from grade school to middle school, you do some natural catch up mourning, you graduate from high school, you walk down the aisle to get married, you give birth to a child. Oh my goodness, the list goes on, and that calls out natural for catch up mourning. But if you go to the wrong clinician and you're experiencing grief bursts or a heightened sense of loss, needing to give more attention, because grief keeps trying to get our attention when we need to give it. But now, if you've internalized out of this medical model application to grief, this linear model, and you go to the wrong clinician, you now have a disorder on top of you're already struggling with your grief. Inappropriate secondary victimization.
yeah, I couldn't agree
I
more.
loved how you used the term that for you personally, you know, you had psychic numbing. You have what we even have terminology for it that wasn't even recognized. It's called psychic numbing, acute aftershock, lasts long beyond what many in our society understand as being shock. And so when people don't understand that, they'll try to push the mourner forward at a time when at 9 months you were ready to go backward before you could go forward. You were ready to be more embracing of being in the dark, metaphorically, than being in the light. And you had to do now some hello work to ever get to any kind of appropriate kind of goodbye, knowing that Eric is still forever a part of your heart and your soul and who you are as a human being. So absolutely.
Yes. One of the beautiful benefits I have seen of our integration of the 10 touchstones and a focus on the 6 needs is that for some people, progress comes in such small increments, especially early on, that they don't even recognize it. And it gives them kind of a perspective, a framework to look back on themselves and to recognize that they have made some headway. And yeah, sometimes the journey is, for no one that I've encountered, the journey is not going to be linear. You're going to be circling back. You're going to be revisiting things, as you always say. You often need to go backwards before you can go forward, and I think it helps people establish some hope that they are making progress, that they're moving in the right direction, and that it takes a long time. And
And by nature, it's slow, it's recursive, and there'll be natural times your grief wants more additional attention, and we shouldn't shame you for that. You also mentioned, and know it's in my heart, about the need to go backward before forward. And if you think of the relationships I've written about in my book called The Paradoxes of Mourning, and you think of our topic today of prolonged grief disorder, part of why we've seen the evolution of disorder is a lack of understanding, even by clinicians, of three relationships that I'll briefly mention that have shifted. We used to always know you had to say hello, hello, hello before you ever get to goodbye. We always used to know that you'd have, as Thomas Kempis said, if you live very long on the earth, you're going to have proper sorrows of the soul. You're going to be in the dark way before you're in the light. So we used to know you'd have to be in the dark before light. And we used to know the one you mentioned, which sparked this in me to teach your viewers, is that we always know that you have to go backward before forward, because Kierkegaard, the existentialist, was right when and asked about death. He said, when it comes to death, while eventually you will go forward, meaning and purpose is drawn by following your instinct to go backward. And so I love to teach that workshop where we need to say hello to get to goodbye. We're going to be dark before light. We're going to go backward before forward. But because there's been a contamination and a shift of the relationships, we now think we should cure people instead of care for people.
yeah,
And that to me is just so sad and so tragic. We've lost our understanding of the word melancholia. You ask anybody under 35 or 40, what is it? I don't know. Well, everybody used to know that. That meant downward movement in your psyche. You'd have a ceremony, go to exile. When you came out, you wore mourning clothes, and even strangers would approach you and say, I am so sorry. We knew of another significant relationship that ties to all this. We knew that the significance of your loss needed to be affirmed before in any way it could be integrated and transformed and changed, So, but now we've got that out of order. We try to transcend people without affirming them. And that happened because, well, for various reasons. We lost death symbols in the late 1960s, early 70s. We're a youth-oriented culture. All sorts of things contributed to that. But anyway, thanks for letting me
I'm
expound on
also
that.
curious, I guess, and I think this will be our wrap-up question, but I know that you've written about the slow grief movement, and I'm really curious about that. I assume that it's something that's focused on the subject matter we've been covering so far in this interview.
Well, yeah, thank you. It fits. I close some of my workshops and my teachings advocating for please consider joining me in what I call the slow grief movement. And why do I do that? I do that to counter this confusion of efficiency with effectiveness. I do it to counter the linear application. I do it to keep us in a companion-based model, not a treatment model of grief care. And so, yeah, I've written about it. And to me, what slow grief does, one, Greg, it acknowledges that loss is as much a part of our human experience, one, as is love. It recognizes that loss changes us forever. It's anchored in not a resolution-based model, but a transformation model, which means an entire change in form. You and Marianne found your whole vision and mission in honor of Eric because you were transformed and changed forever. And now you've gone on to beautifully touch many, many lives that need a safe place where they can disengage from normal demands and go as slow as they need to go. It also understands it's actually by its nature a very slow process that, as in our dialogue here today, we've understood that it requires convalescence, and it is by its nature is recursive and just very, very, very slow. So when we mismatch that with solution-oriented therapies or cognitive behavioral therapies, while there can be elements of that, when that's somebody's sole approach to a mourner, it's more like they're interested in getting rid of symptoms than going slow and helping people come out of the dark to light. It also proclaims the need for longer-term forms of support, which counters the linear 12-month model for adults or 6 months for kids, which is absolutely ludicrous in my experience. It also supports and advocates for caregiving that is slow as that mourner needs it to be, and that is heart-based. It's not head-based, is what I would say to you. So I invite people listening into you and I today to join me and join you, because I know you affirm that grief is slow. So let's invite them to join us in the slow grief movement.
Thank you so much for taking time to meet with me today. As always, it's been enlightening. I think this will be information that will be a great service to our clients and to the listeners in this